This video shows how to turn a rechuckable bottom. Sometimes a piece needs to be returned to the lathe due to misuse, age, wear and tear, or misadventure. Other times, it is necessary to turn and finish the bottom first, as to do it last might prove difficult or impossible. Either way, a rechuckable bottom certainly provides a solution to these dilemmas. The piece I am working on here is for a smudge pot, and I am turning end grain. For this I use very sharp tools, relatively short strokes, and I keep the tool rest fairly close to the work. First I true up the first half to 3/4 of an inch, and then I remove the material from the center for the chuck hole. I am leaving a fairly wide rim here as the outside of the piece needs to be turned, and I am leaving some leeway for this. Now, I reverse my gouge and work toward the outside edge. This is a satisfying cut, but can be tricky. Each pass is done carefully without removing too much material. The first pass does not go right to the edge of the rim but stops short. I will explain why later in the video. Each successive pass is fractionally shorter than the previous one. I have found through experience that bringing all passes to the same finishing point can cause the tool to jam, providing a surprise to the turner and damage to the work. Next, I use my skew tool to finish cutting the angle for the chuck. The angle on the skew is just about perfect for the indent required for the chuck. By having the full cutting edge come in contact with the wood at the bottom of the cut, I end up with the right angle. Again, I make a series of incremental cuts, removing material until I reach the point where I stopped on the first outward pass with the gouge. You can now see the bevel that is left between the last cut of the skew and the rim. This keeps the sharp edge of the cut away from fingers that will be handling the finished piece. It also somewhat disguises the fact that the bottom is rechuckable. Although the bottom is now rechuckable, I don't stop here. I also like to have the bottom sanded and finished before I move on to the next stages. I like to start with grit 120, but sometimes have to commence with grit 80. I sand the center section only until I reach grit 180. Let me digress a little and talk about sanding. I only purchase 3-inch diameter discs. I have noticed for the most part that when sanding I only use the outside half-inch of the disc. I have a 2-inch sanding pad that I use in tight places like the insides of my stick vases. I cut my 3-inch discs down to fit my 2-inch pad by removing the half-inch of used area. For sanding the rechuckable bottoms, I found that I needed a pad smaller than 2 inches. I took an old 2-inch pad and cut it down on the bandsaw to make the 1-inch pad shown here. I cut down the 2-inch discs to fit the new pad, and then had a very functional system for sanding the rechuckable bottoms. This method also allows me to get full service from my discs. Note that when sanding the center, you cannot effectively sand right to the edge because of the inset area for the chuck. Do not let this bother you. I will cover this later in this video. When sanding with grit 180, I also sand the rim. The rim is true and only needs a light sanding. Hitting it with every grit will take it out of flatness. Starting with grit 180, I sand the rim with every other grit. With the next grit, 240, I sand the center and the bevel. I usually sand the center first, sand the bevel next, then return and touch up the center. At 320, I sand everything. Usually the center first, the bevel next, the rim, and then the center again. The reason for coming back to the center is that when doing the bevel, the edge of the disc touches down in the center area, and this usually needs touching up. Next is grit 400, and I only sand the center area. The final grit is 600, and here I sand the bevel first, then the center, and finally the rim. Now I put the tool rest back in place for the final detail. The arrow points to the area that I was unable to sand. At this point, I accent this by drawing notice to it. I take the point of my skew and touch it lightly to the point where the sanded and unsanded areas intersect. I put a single light groove here. The accent comes when I finish it. The unsanded area looks darker. I find that it looks sophisticated and removes the necessity of a difficult and time-consuming sanding job. At this point, I usually put a coat of finish on the bottom and let it dry overnight. For this piece, I waxed and buffed it before mounting it in the chuck and turning the other end. The accented area now goes unnoticed as it appears to be part of the design. I have and will be posting other videos to show how rechuckable bottoms that are too large for traditional chucks may be remounted on the lathe. This marks the end of this video.